Hello and welcome back to News World on Newsroom Africa, Channel 405. Thank you for joining us. My name is Vic Nadu. We're joined in studio by Awande Zwane, who is an Africa researcher. She's joining us in studio and giving us some of her insights and some of the stories happening. And we're talking about Algeria. Algeria they've been in protest action for many weeks now. They have upcoming elections on the 12th of December. Young people are angry at the unemployment rate. They're angry at corruption. They're angry at an older elite who they say are out of touch. They're also demanding that the military hand over power to them and also release some opposition leaders. I mean, the fact that the military has arrested some of the opposition leaders, doesn't that indicate some sort of dissent towards democracy? Dissidents, rather, excuse me.
Sorry, can you just repeat that?
I'm saying, so the military, they've now obviously arrested opposition leaders.
Yeah.
That obviously does indicate dissidence.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can't expect that such radical...
Intolerance to dissidents.
Yes. Yeah. We wouldn't be able to expect that such radical change would go unchallenged. So it's only natural, of course, that with the young people resisting the old order will also resist the change because it's in their interest to be in power. It destabilizes them, it changes the status quo for them. So certainly we are seeing that from the side of the old order, which is still in power in the military, there will be huge resistance against all opposition.
And I'm also wondering, because there are two sides to this and both sides are not willing to compromise. Could this lead to like a deeper political crisis in the country? I mean, what happens next if I'm concerned of two things: deep political crisis. Also, do the protesters have power? Because if they don't vote, I mean, given the way the constitution works and how the voting system works, they need the protesters to go and vote come December 12th, or there can be no leader.
I mean, I think everyone is against the old order, if you can call it that. Not everyone is on the side of the protesters. So there definitely will be people who are going to show up at the polls. But again, I think, like I said, it then becomes a question of, should the elections go on and voter turnout is low, are we still going to accept that as a legitimate win? Whoever comes out victorious from that election, are they going to be accepted by the people? Are they going to be recognized by the international community? So that for me is really what's going to come into play here. I think, of course, the protests will continue. So it's sort of going to be two different things at play, two different things happening at once. But for me, I think the real interesting thing will be, what will the response of the international community be? Because I think then that would be able to sort of dictate sort of whether or not the protests will have been effective, whether or not the action will have been effective.
And we've seen protest action recently very effective. I mean, I would like to ask you what can be done to break this deadlock, but obviously you could put two together that the protesters are not budging. They want power handed over to them. They want some of this ruling elite to be removed because they say, okay, cool, yes, you're coming up with a new name, but it's the same policies. Until that happens, until the opposition leaders are released from prison, probably those are the only reasons perhaps the only way a deadlock can be reached, or it can be broken, rather. Let's move on to Zimbabwe. We know that the economy has been in rapid decline over the last decade and even more. I mean, we've heard of horror stories of 18 hours of power cuts. I mean, we have load shedding in South Africa. We've been experiencing it today, but you do not know load shedding unless you've been in Zimbabwe. 18 hours of power cuts, and it happens at the most random of times also. I mean, these power cuts happen when you actually need electricity, not during the day. I mean, not in the early hours of the morning, at prime times when you need to be working, which has obviously had a major impact on the manufacturing sector. Let's talk about the climate change issue and the drought issue. So they've been unable to manufacture food, which means also there's a starvation crisis. We know we've had the doctor strike. These are many factors contributing to the growing food shortages and the declining economy.
Definitely, they're sort of exacerbating an issue that was already there. So as you said, there was an issue. There's been an economic crisis in Zimbabwe, and that has just been deteriorating year after year, even with the change of power, even with the transition in power. That's just sort of just continue to decline with the introduction of new notes. And of course, they were hit with that Hurricane Idai earlier on. So it seems as though when it rains, it pours. It's almost literally for Zimbabwe. And it's not looking as though there is sort of an end in sight. But I think what we can see is that a lot of the SADC countries are actually pushing to have the sanctions that are placed on Zimbabwe sort of allow for the country to participate again internationally in trade.
But would you not say, okay, I mean, lifting some of the sanctions would also open up them to maybe access to credit as well?
Yeah.
They're a huge credit risk.
Yeah.
A huge credit risk could be one of the problems. I mean, you mentioned the introduction of the new dollar, obviously one of the ways the government has tried to intervene, but they're clearly failing at the ways that they're intervening to try and correct these problems that have been created by the government.
Yeah.
Okay, let's maybe talk, and then there's an interesting fact that I saw here. I was going through some figures doing my research. Do you know that 89% of the population has an adult literacy rate? I mean, it's a very educated population. I mean, more than a quarter of this population have now fled the country as well, which also doesn't help the economy very much. What do you think needs to be done now? I mean, United Nations... as an Africa researcher, what else, in your observations, do you think would need to be done to correct or kind of, balance it out a little bit?
That's a really difficult one, just because this situation has gone on for so long and then further worsened and been exacerbated by so many things that it's really difficult to be able to point at a single thing and be like, this is the starting point. But I mean, I guess, wow, it's a difficult one to say because there are a lot of factors at play. A lot of factors that go from politics to the economics and now even the climate. So,
I mean, President Emerson also, he had promised billions to put into the economy to try and boost it, but nothing has happened since then. And it almost feels like a repeat of the past. During former President, the late Mugabe's reign, he had also promised to put billions into to try and boost the economy. But, I mean, it's all these promises, but nothing's happening. I mean, there must be such a level of frustration on the streets for the average Zimbabwean. I mean, how do they even cope with this poverty? How do they make a livelihood?
Yeah, I mean, I think the only issue that I can have that I've seen with Zim is the promises are very big and the potential is also definitely there, but and so is the sort of the brain power is there as well. But in terms of an actual working policy that they've been able to say, like, this is the policy that we're going to go with. This is the policy we're going to implement to try and fix agriculture, to try and fix the mining sector, to try and fix. They failed to actually come with a concrete plan. So they have an end goal, which is we were going to raise all these billions to sort of, revive the economy again. But in terms of a step-by-step process, that we have not been able to see. And they have some brilliant minds within their cabinet, but it seems as though...
You have a brilliant population, that has a literacy rate of 89%. I mean,
one of the highest.
One of the highest in the world, in fact, actually. I mean, how is the average Zimbabwean trying to cope, besides coming to South Africa, a neighboring country, to try and get food and maybe perhaps, seek refuge? How else is the average Zimbabwean trying to survive this?
I mean, I guess...
Who can't come?
Yeah. It's. I mean, always just it's a survival game almost right now in Zimbabwe. But again, the show must go on, sort of thing. So I think for the average Zimbabwean, I think somebody was saying it the other day, they're very slow to anger. They are sort of the type of people who will make a plan. They'll make it work. And I think that's probably been sort of their downfall, but also something that works for them.
Probably save the country from an already security issue. I mean, we've seen security, we've seen major protests, but like you mentioned, that attitude has probably saved the country from a deeper security concern, because, I mean, a situation like this could open the country to major security concerns.
Exactly, which may have the potential of spilling over into other sort of unstable regions, or parts of the region, such as maybe Mozambique.
All right. And finally, before we let you go, Awande, we saw that obviously this week, I mean, we know about Sudan and we know the tense relations that it's had with the U.S. in the past. A lot has happened in Sudan since the ousting of President Bashir. We now see after 23 years they've exchanged ambassadors. What does this mean for bilateral relations between the U.S. and Sudan?
So I actually think that the U.S. Seeing this transition in the leadership and governance in Sudan, I think they are sort of trying to position themselves in a favorable way for Sudan, especially with all the gas and the oil, the gas discoveries within that eastern region of Africa. So for me, I think it has more of a, it has its ties more in economics and resources. So I think the U.S. is really just trying to be in a place where once Sudan has finally fully stabilized and sort of found its feet and sort of how they're going to govern themselves.
They're aware of the gravy train.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
How are they going to be positioned to be able to just receive and benefit from that.
Right, well, there you have it. Awande Zwane joining us in studio, an Africa researcher, unpacking some of the stories. Speaking of plummeting African resources, a little bit later we're going to be talking about Namibia. We know that the president has now seeked another, well, he's now won another re-election. And there's also, they've been rocked by a fishing scandal, a fishery scandal, a company, an Icelandic fishing company, plummeting African resources. Quite insightful. We've got analyst Jenny Mighty joining us a little bit later in the studio. Take a short break. News will continues next.